There we go. All right, my name is Elizabeth Dinchel. I work at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum, and that is part of the National Archives and Records Administration, but I'm not in Washington, D.C. I'm in West Branch, Iowa, so if you're ever coming through Iowa, you can stop by and say hi. So I want us to start off today. I want you guys to go into the chat bar for me. What were the laws regarding racial segregation in 1929 and where did they apply? So you guys have to think about this. 1929, what were the laws regarding racial segregation and where did they apply? So you guys can put some answers in the chat bar here and I will take a look at them. Mostly in the South, separation of white and blacks, Jim Crow laws, someone's saying. Yes, all very good. So I want to select this website for just a second. It's called The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow, and it's from PBS, and it gives us some really great interactive maps that shows us where segregation was across the country. So this is where education was segregated. And you can see it kind of follows along what we would call the Mason-Dixon line, which separated the North and the South during the Civil War. Hospitals and prisons, a little less. So what this is talking about is the law between people of different races getting married. So that means that if you are two different races, you can't get married across all of these states. So I want you guys to think about something else too while I'm showing you this, because there's states out west that have some of these segregation laws. Can anybody take a guess who those laws applied to? What groups of people? This shows public accommodations, transportation. So think about like buses, trains, airplanes. And then other, I'm not sure what that is. But if we look at things that are in the West, those largely affected Native American populations and people who were probably a lot of the time from Mexico as well. So let's go back here and take a look. So let's talk about the Constitution and the law here. We're going to look at the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. So let's take a look here at what this is really saying. Does the 14th Amendment distinguish American citizens by race? Does the 14th Amendment ban discrimination? What do you guys think? Put some things in the chat box. Do you think the 14th Amendment is supposed to prevent discrimination? So we got some people saying yes. So let's look at another famous case. This was called Plessy versus Ferguson. And this was a Supreme Court case in 1896. And part of this ruling says, we consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this is to be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. The argument also assumes that social prejudice may be overcome by legislation and that equal rights cannot be secured except by an enforced commingling of the two races. If the civil and political rights of both races be equal, One cannot be inferior to the other civilly or politically. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane. In legal interpretation, we call this the separate but equal doctrine. And you'll hear that a lot when people talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. So in the chat box, can anyone tell me what 1954 case overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and said, separate can never be equal? Does anybody know which case that was? 1954, very good, Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education destroyed Plessy versus Ferguson. So let's keep that in mind though, this is 1896 and the time period we're talking about today is 1929. So Plessy versus Ferguson and Jim Crow laws are what is occurring across the country right now. So now I want us to look at 1901. This is the first year since Reconstruction that the entire legislature is white. The legislature will remain 100% white until 1929. On October 16th, 1901, Theodore Roosevelt had Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner. Washington was a trusted advisor to Roosevelt and a close family friend. It was the first time an African-American person was invited to a meal at the White House. Meals were viewed as equality in the South. And that's why you see along the bottom of that table there, it says equality in big letters. And this was something that ran in newspapers all over the country. So how do you think the press responded to Booker T. Washington and Teddy Roosevelt having dinner together at the White House? Think about that for a second. Give me some answers in the chat box. How do you think the press responded? Some people are saying negatively. So let's see. Yes, the press sunk their teeth into this story. Letters poured into the White House, and Booker T. Washington was stalked on the campus of the Tuskegee Institute. He also had his life threatened, and there was a hit put out for him. When the Hoovers entered the White House in 1929, that was the last time an African-American was a social guest of the White House. And people avoided having African-American guests of the White House because of that incident in 1901. But African-American people were doing business in the White House. There was African-American staff in the White House. They were just not invited to be socially equal in the White House at this point. So let's talk about the people that are involved in what we call the DePriest tea incident. First, let's look at Lou Hoover. Lou consistently honored racial equality, but she did it without spectacle, meaning she didn't tell people about it. She didn't try to be vocal about it. She just kind of kept it to herself. Historians like to call her a silent activist. Lou believed in leadership by example. She worked to improve the living conditions of the African-American staff at the White House. She drove her African-American friends in a car, which was completely unheard of. She also paid the tuition of a young African-American girl to go to college. And the girl's name was Audrey. And she did not know that Lou was paying for her tuition. And Lou was asking the dean for reports on Audrey's progress in school. So she kept in touch that way. But this young woman never found out that Lou Hoover paid her tuition. Robert Morton, an African-American man from the Tuskegee Institute, would visit the White House at least once a month. This was business, but no one really knew about his visits or even really cared. He would even go on to visit 5 more times from 1929 to 1930 after the DePriest tea. So this is Oscar and Jessie DePriest. Oscar was a vocal activist for the African-American community in Chicago. He was elected to Congress in 1901 and was the first Black congressman elected since 1901. He was a Republican, like Hoover, and he represented the Chicago district. I want to put up one of his quotes because I think it's really, really powerful. He said, and you guys remember prohibition is the law right now, so that's the 18th Amendment that outlawed alcohol across the country. Jessie DePriest said, the government is preparing to spend millions for the enforcement of the 18th Amendment. A few million ought to be spent to enforce the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, which guarantee the Negro his civil and political rights, just like the 14th Amendment we looked at. So I want to pause here for a second because this statement is really profound at this time. So do you guys know, and can you think back in what we've learned in history up until this point? Were African Americans prevented from voting in the US from 1901 to 1929? Can you think of some places where maybe African American people didn't have the right to vote? And do you think maybe this is why Black Americans did not have representation in Congress up until this time in 1929? The South, yeah, we see this, the South is like this hotbed of the civil rights movement moving forward from this point. Poll taxes, absolutely. So the Constitution promised people their rights, right? But then the states blocked it. And that's what people are saying in the chat bar. And you're absolutely right. Fear and intimidation was a huge part of it. So let's go to the next slide here, I think. All right. I love this picture. This is Jessie DePriest. I think it's a beautiful portrait. So we'll leave it up there while we talk about the teas. Mrs. Hoover was charged with hosting teas for the wives of the congressmen. These teas were huge because they included women who were also related to the wives. The guest list was well over 600 people, so the teas would be staged in a series of get-togethers. And I want you guys to keep in mind that DC was different at this time. When someone was elected, they moved their entire family to Washington, DC. So the wives became friends, they did things socially together. They might even have some levers to pull on their husbands to say, hey, what are you thinking about this law? So this was to help kind of build that community around the wives who were new to Washington, DC, and they could maybe meet the wives that had been there for a long time. Lou is also newly in the White House, and she was faced with this decision of whether or not to invite Jessie DePriest, the first African-American congressional wife in nearly 30 years. In late May 1929, Lou's secretary wrote to Walter Newton, the lead political aide to the president, and said, the question arises as to what can be done about the family of our new colored representative. Mrs. Hoover wishes me to ask for your suggestion and to remind you that we must not think of only this occasion, but of what is to be done during the entire term of the representative. So think about that for a minute. Lou and Herbert Hoover are married, and Lou's secretary writes to President Hoover's aide and secretary so that they can come up with this decision together. There wasn't just one person involved in this decision. So the teas happen in several waves. And on the day of the last tea, Mrs. Hoover instructed her secretary to send the invitation to Jessie DePriest. And these letters up here are from that they were to the messenger that was going to take the invitations. And Lou's secretary warns the messenger that the information is confidential and to refrain from giving information regarding it. Lou carefully chose who was going to attend the tea with Mrs. DePriest. She worked really hard to insulate Jessie from racist women, protests, or boycotts. She wanted to make sure that Jessie received the same hospitality as any of the other guests. Lou's precautions did not matter much because Oscar DePriest announced the invitation to the press. So we only have one day's notice that this is going to happen. Oscar DePriest has now told the press, even though Lou Hoover told her messenger to keep it secret. So the tea takes place Wednesday, June 12th, 1929. And this is a picture of Jessie on the day that the tea takes place. There was a famous photographer that would take pictures of African-American people, and he was hired to come take this picture of Jessie because everybody knew this was a really important event, right? So you can see the guest list here. It was incredibly small. Like I said, these people were handpicked. Lou knew that they would all be friendly to Jessie. It took place in the green room of the White House, which is this small kind of cozy place in the White House. It's a beautiful spot. You can visit it if you get to go on a White House tour. So the African-American staff reacts to this. Remember, I said there's African-American staff working in the White House. How do you guys think that they reacted to seeing Jessie DePriest in the White House? I'll give you guys a minute. You can type in the chat box. All right, let's take a look. It was a very momentous occasion. I remember the butler, Ellis, his eyes just popping as he passed the tea cakes around. You can imagine what this meant to him to see one of his race being entertained by the wife of the president, and he enjoyed it. And this was written by Ruth Fessler, Lou Henry Hoover's secretary. And there's oral histories with Ellis in the future. And the White House Historical Association is a fantastic website called Tempest in a Teapot. And it tracks and looks at and evaluates this tea and has really great oral history interviews with people who are there and with family members. So now the public reacts. How do you think the public reacts to finding out that Jessie DePriest was entertained at the White House by Lou Henry Hoover? So we're hearing people that DC is kind of between the North and the South, so maybe they were amazed, not well. So let's take a look. We're gonna look at some letters that came in. And this one's a telegram that came into the White House. And it starts off, allow me to congratulate you on the stand you have taken in reference to invitation of Mrs. Oscar DePriest at the White House. You could have done nothing less consistent with good policy and respect for the feelings of the colored women of the country. Your stock has gone up 100%. So this is a person who is a congressional nominee in the District of New York, which of course is in the North, and he is thanking Lou Henry Hoover for inviting Jessie DePriest. Now we have this letter from this man in St. Louis, and he sends it. Dear Mr. President, so he addresses it to President Hoover, not Mrs. Hoover, but Mr. Hoover, and says, I, as just a plain citizen of the United States that voted for you for president, join with my fellow Democrats of Texas and Florida and elsewhere in bowing my head in shame at our lack of judgment. In the face of warning that the Republican Party leans towards social equality with Negroes, we were swept off our feet for the time being, but you can rest assured it will never happen again. Social equality between the Negro and the white man cannot be accomplished in this country half as quickly as a Roman Catholic can be elected president. And we saw how impossible that was last fall. Just as a quick aside, President Hoover ran against a man who was Catholic, and that dominated the campaign. It was very ugly. It won't work. Just because the Republican Party is in power doesn't make it right to attempt to force such an abhorrently low standard of social appraisement of our race down our throats. Of course, I do not expect even recognition of this letter because I do not amount to enough in this country to justify it. But I think the people who think like I do and other voters amount to considerable, and I am writing this to you for whatever it's worth. Sincerely and respectfully, Ben Larrabee, you can see he's from St. Louis. So we get this mixed bag of reactions from people that are coming into the Hoovers. And I do want to tell you guys, because I think this is a really important part of history. I chose a letter that was very calm, considering the other letters that were sent in are so offensive that I wouldn't put them in the in this presentation, but I do give them to students when they come to the archives so that they can react to them, because it's really important for us to know the scope of what people actually thought. There was threats to lynch Lou Hoover and Jessie DePriest that were mailed to Lou Hoover and to the White House. There was a lot of really awful things that both of these women were called and things that were said. So I just want you guys to know that this was one of the most calm letters that came in that were not did not support Lou. There's also a ton of letters that did support Lou, and I think it's really important that you know that as well. So the press reacts. How do you guys think the press reacts to finding out that an African-American woman was hosted socially at the White House? You guys can use that chat bar to type some things in. And I'm going to start pulling some of these up. We get a mixed bag of reactions. And so at the Hoover Library, we have folders and folders and folders of these newspaper clippings kind of tracking what happened. Ultimately, it stirred reactions. The press coverage of this really enhanced how people reacted to it. It invoked really harsh reactions from Democratic states that voted for Republican Hoover, who promised he was not going to challenge the racial status quo. Hoover won Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia, the first time a Republican had won those states since Reconstruction. Many states introduced legislation to censor or condemn Lou Hoover. Ultimately, Texas, Florida, and Georgia officially vote to censor Lou Hoover. And I pull up this article. This is Jessie and Oscar DePriest here. And you can see that it starts to invoke reactions from Oscar, who is a very vocal activist, right? So you can see here, bunch of cowards is what the Negro congressman calls the legislators of the South. They tried to stop his swearing in into Congress. So they actually swore everybody in all at one time so that they couldn't stop it from happening. They had really treated him very disrespectfully and unfairly. So I think his lash back to this was probably pretty warranted, to be real frank. But you can kind of see how some of these press reactions are coming. And this article is a really great article because it breaks down how the press covered the tea by region. And so it starts off with the South here, and it talks about how terribly the South interpreted this event and talked to people about how they interpreted it. But you can see they look at Memphis and Charlotte and Baltimore and Birmingham, Alabama and Louisville. And basically they say the press coverage isn't good. In the East, and they're talking about the Northeast, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, New York, places that really fought for freedom for slaves and emancipation, they covered it very favorably, of course. And then it looks at the Midwest. Chicago is included in that. And remember, Oscar DePriest is from Chicago. So of course they favorably covered that. But then when you got down into some other places like Missouri and Kansas, it gets a little bit more tricky. It's not covered so favorably. And then in the Southwest, it talks about Texas. It was not covered favorably at all. So I want us to look at political cartoons. And in 1929, political cartoons are really important. We have this huge part of the population who cannot read, which is really interesting for us to think about. That literacy was so low that people have very limited reading skills. So political cartoons kind of served as this like visual narrative of what's going on in the news. And here's one of these political articles, and you can see the man here, it says he's a Southern Hoovercrat instead of a Democrat. That's what they call them, because remember I said all those states had voted for Hoover. And he's holding this paper that says, Mrs. DePriest entertained at the White House. And down at the bottom here, it says, we've been betrayed, sir. So they feel like Hoover betrayed them. And this ran just a few days after the DePriest tea. This ran June 19th. The tea was June 12th. So this is another one. And at the bottom here, it says it's the result of an ignoble experiment. So what they're saying here is that the DePriest tea was a social experiment. And that's how a lot of people in the South really viewed it, that this had never been done before and they didn't know what would happen. There's all these things that they're unjustly scared of. Like we see the Jim Crow laws and they're worried about losing control of all of that. So you see this big man here and it says vicious element of Negro politics. And then he's holding a ladder that says unnatural social aspirations. And so look, there's this wall. It says carefully builded interracial goodwill. So what do you guys think that means? Let's really think about this and break it down. There's a wall. We know there's Jim Crow laws. So is this cartoon showing that they've built a literal wall between African American and white people in the United States to keep them separate but equal? You guys can type in the chat bar. So there's that wall, and then he's holding a ladder. So do you think like what they're saying is that these unnatural social aspirations that African Americans are asking for, because that's what this man represents, is African American politics, that they're trying to like climb over the wall. And then in this case, during DePriest tea, they tried to break down the wall. So there's a lot going on in this cartoon if we really start thinking about all the different elements of it. So people put a lot of thought into these cartoons, and there's a lot of different things that we can think about when we look at these cartoons. So I want us to look at these differences, and I want you guys to type in the chat bar for me. What issues do you think influenced the reactions to this tea? Remember, this is a small tea, it's at the White House, and it invoked this huge reaction from the country. We have states voting to reprimand the First Lady for having a tea. We have letters pouring into the White House threatening the First Lady. We have the press all over the country going wild and huge political ramifications. People saying they don't trust Hoover, he lied to them, they will never vote for him again, they will never trust Republicans to keep the status quo again. So there's a lot of stuff going on. So can you guys think about what some of these issues are that influenced this reaction? We can put some answers in the chat. Well, some of them are going to be that division of the North and the South and those Jim Crow laws, but also that after the Civil War ended and enslaved people were freed, there was this push for Reconstruction to get representation for African American people in the country, to make sure that they were going to be treated equally in some ways. And there was legislation to like force that. And that's kind of what that Plessy versus Ferguson case was saying, was that like you can't legislate equality. But it turns out you can. But they thought you couldn't. And so the way that they stopped people from voting was these poll taxes, these tests, right? All of these weird things so that they could maintain control of the country. So seeing an African American person invited to the White House threatened what they felt like was their way of life. So there's a lot of things that influenced this reaction. So in the end, Lou Hoover's secretaries and Herbert Hoover's secretaries started crafting responses. And one of my favorite things that I've seen, Lou Hoover's secretary wrote in there that there was absolutely no right to discriminate against somebody based on their race, and that the First Lady did not feel that it was responsible to discriminate and would not discriminate. And then she sent it over to Hoover's secretary and said, I don't think this is best coming from Lou. Maybe it needs to come from you. So then Herbert Hoover and his advisors get together, and ultimately this is what came out of it. They said, the president has no statement to make on this at all. So they just decided to let it ride, let the press go nuts. These state legislators had freedom to say whatever they wanted, and they just hunkered down. And kind of remember too that the Great Depression is getting ready to start sinking in really big time after this. So it became less of an issue because there was more important things getting ready to happen. So I want to pose a question back to you guys. There's no right or wrong answer. Was the United States ready for the White House to be publicly desegregated? Why or why not? So think about that. That means publicly. Remember we said Richard Morton had been coming to the White House for months. Nobody knew or cared. But Jessie DePriest came and there's this huge fallout. So do you think that the United States was ready to desegregate the White House? I'll give you guys like a minute or two to write some stuff in the chat box. So someone says no, but politicians knew that it was coming. No. All right. So one of the things that I want you guys to think about after moving on from this was how long ago emancipation had been until this time, and how much longer the White House could have gone without being desegregated. Do you think it would have been better or worse if they had waited or if they had done it earlier? Some people are saying, I don't think the public was ready because it was one of the first places that did it. Someone else said no, because the South was too invested in their segregation status quo. Yeah, I think those are good answers. But I guess that the big question after that is like, at what point do you have to do it? Do you pull the Band-Aid off that you say the 14th Amendment applies here and it applies everywhere else, right? So Hoover hosts a Black delegation on the White House lawn in 1932 and pledges support for Black rights. So let's take a look at this letter here. So this is a speech he delivered. It's October 1st, 1932, and he thanks people for coming. And it says, the platform of the Republican Party speaks with justifiable pride of the friendship of our party for the American Negro that has endured unchanged for 70 years. It pledges itself to the continued insistence upon his rights, that the friendship and consideration of the party for the American Negro has borne fruit is in the advancement of the race. That is evident in business, in the arts and sciences, in the professions, and recently we have seen great achievement of two splendid youths, and it goes on and on and on. And then we see, here's the second half of that. So I guess my question to you is, we see this huge fallout, and by October 1932, it's probably pretty clear that the Depression is really bad and Hoover is probably not going to win the election. So do you think that this is a ploy for votes? Do you think that Hoover and the Republican Party believed in racial equality at this time? What do you guys think? You can write it in the comments. Yeah, so they're doing this, pledging this, and I want to look at Hoover wrote memoirs later on in life. And someone says, yeah, probably has something to do with it. Yeah. So he wrote his memoirs later on in life and was able to reflect back on this entire event. And what happened and how he felt about it and how he felt like it impacted Lou. So I think it's important to look at that because reflection kind of changes the way that we think about events. We think about things as they're going on differently than when we look back on them, right? So Hoover said she received a great wound from this conscientious adherence to duty. During my administration, there was a congressman. He had a wife. In giving the usual tease for congressmen's wives, Mrs. Hoover insisted upon inviting the Negro's wife equally with the others. She was warned by some of her congressional lady friends not to do it. The Negro congressman did not particularly help matters by announcing to the press that his wife had received such an invitation. In consequence, the Southern press denounced this defiling of the White House, and the Southern reporters lined up to watch the colored lady come and go, hoping to witness their prophecy that some congressman's wife would flop out. Mrs. Hoover had more sense than to give any such occasion for affront to her guest or to the White House, nor did she wish to offend the ladies from the South. Therefore, she divided her congressional tea into different days and placed the Negro lady on the first day with the ladies who had been previously tested as to their feelings. The speeches of the Southern senators and congressmen, the editorials in the Southern press, and the denunciatory resolution by the Texas legislator wounded her deeply. Her tears, however, did not melt her indomitable determination. I sought to divert the lightning by at once inviting Dr. Morton of Tuskegee to lunch with me. The White House was thus defiled several times during my term. So what Hoover says is that immediately followed up with inviting another African-American for a social event to eat with him, just as Teddy Roosevelt had done. So he invited someone from Tuskegee Institute again, Dr. Morton, who he'd been friends with and who had been an advisor to him. So he actively sought to instigate this issue after Lou had tea with Jessie DePriest. The White House never went back to being segregated after this. Directly after Hoover and left the White House, FDR came in, and Eleanor and Franklin both had African-American guests in the White House. So the White House would remain desegregated after that. So that is what I have for today. I have my email address up here. If you guys haven't done National History Day, I always want to encourage you guys to look into that, think about topics. You can always reach out to me if you're thinking about doing it, and I can kind of help you along the way. If you guys have questions, you can type them in the chat box. I'll look out for like a minute or two for questions, and then we will end. I really appreciate you guys coming out today. I know it's different learning when we're not at school, but we still get to learn. It's still fun. Thank you guys. Someone says, why is there this perception that the Hoovers were not kind to their White House staff? You know, there's a lot of really interesting perceptions about the Hoovers, and I think it's because they were so private. They didn't talk about a lot of stuff that they were doing and what was going on. Hoover kind of thought of like good deeds as just being part of being human. And that turned out to be one of the flaws that really affected him during the Great Depression. He depended on people's honesty and goodwill to stop or slow down the Great Depression, and people weren't operating on a handshake. So like Lou paid for Audrey's college tuition, she didn't want to tell anybody about that. So the improvements that were made to the White House for the African-American staff were relatively hushed until later. And you guys can go to YouTube after this, to the Herbert Hoover YouTube page, and there's video that Lou took. She took the first color footage of the White House, and you can see that she took footage of the staff working, and they were laughing and working together in the garden and stuff like that. So it's really clear they had a good relationship, and you know, was really open to helping them and changing things to make things better for them. So I don't know. I think it's just a symptom of not talking about yourself enough. And that was a really you know, I think it was an admirable trait of the Hoovers at the same time. Any more questions for me? All right, well, we will wrap up. Thank you guys for coming. We have another one next week on the bonus march on Friday. And on Wednesday, I'm doing, it says it's for junior high, but it's on reorganizing the executive branch. It's also pretty cool for high school. So if you're bored, you can log in for that one too. All right, thank you guys. See you next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.